This can hardly be called American aid, can it? When Donald Trump railed against Vladimir Putin at a recent conference, he expressed deep dissatisfaction with the Russian leader's actions. Trump claimed that while Putin talked a good game, he was in fact expanding the war. Vowing to teach Putin a lesson, Trump announced the resumption of weapons assistance to Ukraine. For the Zelensky government and its European allies who have struggled to support Ukraine, it seemed the darkest days were nearly over. They never imagined, however, that Trump's assistance would come with a catch. Europe would have to pay for it in full. The demand was so galling that even Kaja Kallas, the EU's foreign minister, an Estonian typically seen as a pro-American hawk and a staunch critic of Russia and China, found it unacceptable. She couldn't help but publicly complain that Trump was inviting everyone to dinner but making others pay the bill. This reveals just how deep Europe's resentment toward American maneuvering runs. But Trump, clearly, couldn't care less about Europe's frustration. He was even proud of himself for devising what he saw as a perfect solution that killed three birds with one stone. It would pressure Russia into accepting a ceasefire, it wouldn't completely torpedo U.S.-Russia relations, and most importantly, the U.S. would make a profit. So why was Trump so certain that Europe would be forced to swallow this bitter pill and pay the price for America's grandstanding? The truth is, this is far from the first time the U.S. has stuck Europe with the check. In the past, however, America's methods were less blatant than Trump's. After World War II, the United States worked to prevent the spread of Soviet influence in Europe by both fanning the flames of ideological confrontation and positioning itself as a savior providing aid and protection. During this period, the U.S. offered tangible benefits to win Europe over. The Marshall Plan helped accelerate Europe's reconstruction, while the existence of NATO allowed European nations to keep their own military spending low and focus wholeheartedly on economic development. But beneath this seemingly perfect arrangement was a harsh reality. Europe's economic lifelines were now controlled by the United States. Even more critically, Europe had lost the strategic option of de-escalating tensions with the Soviet Union. As a result, throughout the Cold War, Europe was forced to serve as the front line, bearing the psychological burden of a potential and possibly devastating war at any moment. It wasn't until the fall of the Berlin Wall
It was not until the fall of the Berlin Wall and the collapse of the Soviet Union that the shadow of war finally began to recede from the continent. However, the Soviet Union's dissolution wasn't entirely good news for Europe. Once its greatest threat had vanished, the U.S. turned its sights on the Europeans. From an American perspective, this was hardly surprising. After all, the so-called ideological struggle had always been a propaganda tool. The real reason for the mortal combat between the U.S. and the USSR was always national interest. America's goal is global hegemony. With the Soviet Union gone, China still relatively weak, and nations like Japan and South Korea politically and militarily contained by the U.S., who was left as the most significant threat? Europe. Furthermore, Europe itself was not content to sit still. There were always those who, dreaming of past imperial glory, sought to unite the continent, break free from American control, and even challenge the U.S. on the world stage. Shortly after the Soviet Union collapsed, European nations upgraded the European Community, a primarily economic body, into the European Union, a fully fledged political and economic entity. In 1999, they launched the euro, a direct challenge to the U.S. dollar's dominance. How could America not move to discipline such a backstabbing upstart before its core interests were threatened? Consequently, since the end of the Cold War, most of America's major strategic decisions have inflicted significant collateral damage on Europe. The Kosovo War, ostensibly fought to clean up socialist remnants and curb Russia's evil influence, severely undermined Europe's security environment. It caused massive capital flight to the U.S. and badly damaged the reputation of the euro, which had been highly regarded before the conflict. The Iraq War, framed as a counterterrorism effort, drove up oil prices while strategically stoking internal divisions within Europe. The starkly different positions of old Europe and new Europe on the war deepened the cracks within the EU. The Arab Spring, promoted under the banner of ideology, deliberately destabilized the Middle East, unleashing a severe refugee crisis upon Europe. Yet Europe never seems to learn its lesson. After getting burned once, it still falls for America's high-minded excuses the next time the U.S. stirs up trouble in its neighborhood, effectively stabbing itself in the back. The most classic example is how Europe, thoroughly convinced by the Russian threat narrative and consumed by fear, willingly went along with America's relentless pressure on Russia, ultimately triggering the Russia-Ukraine war. When the conflict devolved into a war of attrition, the U.S. predictably began to pull back halfway through its aid commitments, forcing Europe to shoulder more of the burden. Europe was once again left dumbfounded. Even so, on the surface, Europe and the U.S. remain close allies. Although the U.S. instigated the events that hurt Europe, Europe actively participated for its own strategic calculations. In the end, the U.S. reaped the benefits, while Europe gained almost nothing and had to pay a steep price. One could argue that this was due to Europe's own incompetence, a botched attempt that backfired, rather than solely a case of American sabotage.
Anyone accustomed to thinking critically, like the Chinese, would see the U.S. consistently benefiting while Europe suffers the consequences and would naturally start to question America's motives. European leaders, however, have consistently bought into the surface-level narrative. This is why Europe found it particularly hard to accept when Trump finally ripped away the facade of the U.S.-Europe alliance. After being repeatedly frustrated in his dealings with Putin, a deeply dissatisfied Trump decided to resume weapons aid to Ukraine to pressure Russia into ceasefire talks. Europe thought U.S.-Europe relations were finally getting back on track, but before they could even celebrate, they were hit with a new blow. Trump declared that his aid to Ukraine, unlike Biden's, wouldn't be about sacrificing American interests to help some irrelevant country. Instead, it was about achieving American strategic goals while also making money for the U.S. Although Ukraine is broke, its economy held together only by American and European aid, Europe has money and cannot afford to abandon Ukraine. Therefore, Europe could simply pay for the American military aid in full. This statement completely shattered the fantasy held by European politicians that if Trump simply recognized Russia's untrustworthiness, the U.S. would return to Europe's side. It was a complete meltdown. Even Kaja Kallas, the staunchly pro-American, anti-Russia, and anti-China EU foreign minister, couldn't help but complain about Trump making others pay the bill. One can only imagine the outrage among politicians in countries like France, Italy, and Spain, who still harbor ambitions of European independence. All three nations voiced clear opposition. But Trump paid their objections no mind. And as it turned out, his confidence was not misplaced. Under American pressure, Germany quickly caved, agreeing to purchase 2 Patriot missile systems from the U.S. for delivery to Ukraine. This kind of chump behavior from Europe is undoubtedly shocking to many who still view the continent through the lens of its legacy as a collection of advanced, powerful nations. But if you look at Europe without that traditional power filter, its capitulation is not surprising at all. During the Cold War, America's protection certainly allowed Europe to avoid an arms race, freeing up its finances for economic development and rapid prosperity. But every coin has 2 sides. This outsourcing of security also led to a severe decline in Europe's own military capabilities, especially in terms of industrial mobilization and production. Today, even France, a nation that prides itself on independence and once withdrew from NATO, relies on American purchases for much of its advanced equipment. Other European nations don't even possess complete domestic military industrial chains. In peacetime,
This might not seem like a problem, but when faced with the risk of war, military weakness becomes Europe's Achilles heel. It was precisely this realization that made Europe so wary of Russia after the Soviet collapse, causing it to cling to America's coattails and support NATO's eastward expansion in an attempt to create a larger security buffer. But they apparently never considered that Russia, while stronger than any single European nation but weaker than the NATO
bloc, also needs a security buffer to ease its own anxieties. Russia could never tolerate NATO pushing right up to its doorstep, constantly threatening its very existence. Europe's unilateral pursuit of absolute security ultimately provoked Russia, triggered a counterattack, and shattered the continent's peace. The outbreak of the war in Ukraine has left Europe terrified, especially after discovering that economic sanctions, the weapon they thought would be a silver bullet, failed to bring Russia to its knees. Europe understands that for a nation to start a war under the current international system requires immense strategic resolve. But once that nation has defied global pressure and set its war machine in motion, it's often easier to continue the war than to stop it, unless the costs become truly unbearable. Europe doesn't actually care about the fate of Ukraine itself. What it absolutely cannot risk is betting that Russia, after swallowing Ukraine, won't continue pushing west. American protection, as history has proven, is not entirely reliable. And Europe's own military strength is, in some respects, even weaker than Ukraine's. The outside world may have unrealistic expectations due to the developed nation filter, but Europeans know their own situation and can't fool themselves. For Europe, confronting Russia is a non-negotiable reality. For this reason, Europe must go all out in its support for Ukraine. Even during the period when the US had seemingly abandoned Ukraine, Europe firmly reiterated its commitment. But Europe's own military-industrial capacity is clearly insufficient to meet Ukraine's needs. Ultimately, it has to buy from the United States. So, in practical terms, Trump's demand doesn't actually create a new hardship for Europe. The real issue is that Trump wants to take all the credit for Europe's contribution, which is humiliating. But compared to the alternative, the US refusing to provide any weapons at all, this embarrassment is a small price to pay. In a way, Europe should probably even be grateful that America is willing to supply the weapons again.